Good morning, everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is the latest installment of the Living Leadership webinar series, which is brought to you with support from the Sylvan Laureate Foundation and the American Express Foundation. Today I'm here with a couple of special guests from MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Arts. Just to go over the agenda very quickly, today we're going to be doing some introductions of our special guest presenters, a little bit of background about who MICA is, and what social design is. Then we'll talk about core principles of social design, go through a case study, share some resources, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I just want to welcome and thank our guest presenters today from MICA, Jonathan Erwin and Mira Azarm. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Eric. It's so great to be here. Good morning, everyone from Baltimore. It's a beautiful day here. So just to give you a little bit of quick background about myself, Jonathan will talk about himself in a second, but we both just recently finished the Robert W. Deutsch Social Design Fellowship, and that's through the Center for Social Design at Maryland Institute College of Art. I am currently teaching and facilitating at the University of Maryland in the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and I'm also a faculty member in the Center for Social Design at MICA.
And hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Erwin. I'm currently a design associate at the Maryland Institute College of Art, working within the Center for Social Design, as well as working on a whole host of freelance projects and other things around social impact.
Yeah, and so just to give you a little bit of context about the Center for Social Design, the Center for Social Design offers a Master's in Social Design, which Jonathan and I both graduated from in 2013. It's a one-year MA, and the purpose of this webinar isn't to do a sell for the social design program, but we did want to just mention it because the principles that we're talking about here are the way that the Center for Social Design sort of sees and interprets social design. There's a lot of different approaches to it that you'll see, but this is our specific one, so we wanted to make sure that we mention that. And so we'll jump right into what social design is. We like to start with this quote about the role traditionally of a designer, and most of you would be familiar with the role of a designer as someone who interprets information after it's already been determined by someone else. In the case of social change, you see that a lot with social scientists or economists. Okay, here's what we think is going to be the best approach, so now the designer might take it on in a visual way. What we're doing now in the social design field as it's emerging is we're actually participating in the process, and we're using the process itself to move the social issue forward in a different way, making connections. So just to give a really simple analogy, those of you who may be familiar with communication design or graphic design would know that you're usually looking at form and function as the formula or the approach. So you're going to design with a form in mind, so let's say a brochure, and the brochure is going to raise awareness. That's kind of an easy way of looking at it. The way that we look at approach social design is that we're actually using participation as part of the formula. So we're doing form and function, but that's multiplied by the input, who's involved, and then you're looking at how it's implemented as a really key aspect of the approach. If you don't have participation and you don't have implementation in mind, then you're not doing social design effectively. And I'll get into that in a second with the core principles. All right, so just a couple brief things because we're going to go into depth into it, but just to give you a really cursory sense of how social design works, it's human-centered, so there's a user in mind, and it's empathetic. That means that we are always looking at who's involved. That means it's not just a one-sided thing like, oh, it's the end user. There's often who are the people in between. And what's really unique about this is that people are often actually neglected in how we do, how we work. So it's unusual to put people first and foremost in the process. The second component is that it integrates social responsibility and social justice. So if you are doing something and it's not for the purpose of positive social change, it's probably not social design. And then the third element is that it's collaborative. It's with, not for. And this is really important because the social designer doesn't assume or shouldn't assume that they know what's best for a particular group or particular case. It's all about working with people and trying to determine the outcome together. And just wanted to throw this in there, social designers have fun too. It's not, even though we're working on serious issues, it isn't about being serious all the time. Even though most of these issues are very grave and have issues that go back, you know, years, decades, whatever, people still want to have joy in their life, and the process should be joyful. So as we go through this, you'll see pictures with Post-its, you'll see people working together. The social designer tries not to be argumentative or confrontational. There's always a way to bring fun into the mix, and so just remember that as we go through this. Okay, so we're going to outline some core principles. There's a big long list here. Thankfully, this webinar will be available to you for posterity, so you don't have to write it all down. But we're going to start first and foremost with ethics and empathy. Now, what we say by ethics and empathy, I mean, the key question here is, what is the role and responsibility of the designer in society? That's really how social design started, especially at MICA. Most designers look at, well, you know, what does the client want and need, and how can we help the client? Well, in this case, there's a bit of a proactivity on the designer's part, the social designer's part, to say, what can I do to get something started? And so maybe the social designer is the one moving forward, or maybe the social designer is linking up with someone who has an issue and there's no clear sense of where to go with it. Well, ethics and empathy are so important because you want to, first of all, understand, or at least try to arrive at an understanding with the audiences and the people you're working with. That's always important, and objectivity is key as well. And then ethics is, how can you do this in as responsible a way as possible? Because it's, when you're working with people, it's really easy to overlay your own issues and also to have your own agenda. And so you have to be really clear about what that is. And so starting up front with this, with the audience, is extremely important. So the second one that we find extremely pivotal to the process is teaming and collaboration. In the social design program, we look at teaming as how do we work together in the graduate program. But out in the world, when you're working on these projects, teaming is critical because you want to be working on these things together with your partners. And that means that you're forming a team together. And they're often, or they should be, interdisciplinary. And for any of you who've worked with people in different fields or contexts, you know that if it was easy, everyone would do it well. And the fact is, it's really challenging. So social designers try to facilitate and enable the process in a way that everyone can contribute and be of value, but not assume that everyone is going to work exactly the same way or have the same thing to contribute. So it's really important that we find ways to work with different personality styles, to be self-aware and intentional in how we work. And then that allows us also to facilitate other types of things, like workshops, for example. Sometimes we're coming in and we're helping other people figure out how to move forward in the process. Maybe they've gotten stuck, or they're just trying to look at something in a new way. So as social designers, we can come in and be objective and also help them work through some of these things in a fun and effective way. Social literacy is tenet number 3. And this is something that's extremely hard to do because whenever you go into a new context, let's say you come into the Masters in Social Design program and you're not from Baltimore, you come from another part. I am from outside of DC, so it's not that far, but I'm still coming into a city where I don't really understand all of the different issues at stake in terms of race, in terms of policy, how people work with each other, and what the history is of other types of efforts that have been going on. All of these things are interconnected, and they're extremely difficult to understand. So social literacy is not just trying to get a sense of what it's like on the ground, but it's also having humility, coming in and saying, I don't know all the answers, and I don't know necessarily what's right. And people will respect you a lot more if you can come in and say that instead of just saying, oh, well, this is what you need to do. If any of you have ever tried to look at a problem or an issue that's affecting you in your, like, exactly where you live, you'll know that sometimes it's even harder to see all of those issues when they're right in front of you. So there is value to going into a different environment and providing maybe an objective stance. At the same time, you can't do it without realizing that you need to have sensitivity of the situation, and again, be humble and ask for other people to participate, because they're the ones who are really going to be the key to moving forward. So principle number 3, design research. And this is important. It's not just something you do by yourself on the internet. You want to work with other stakeholders, and you want to try to define problems. You can't just go in and say, well, a lot of people will say, oh, I know what the solution is, so we're going to develop this. Well, social design would say, you don't know the solution, or you can't develop solutions until you know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. One of the methods we do for this is called problem definition, where we actually redundantly say we want to define the problem. And an example of that would be that, let's say there's, in a neighborhood, people aren't talking to each other. You might say, oh, well, we should have a monthly meeting where everyone can get together. Well, before you say, let's do a monthly meeting, you have to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Is it communication amongst the neighbors? Is it that they feel alienated from each other? Maybe there was a real estate transaction that happened a couple years ago, and a whole lot of people moved out, and then there's a new group of people, and they don't know each other very well. So you have to really sit and analyze, like, what are the different things that are happening in this context. And when we say qualitative and quantitative research methodologies, which is in the second sentence, what we're talking about is we use a variety of ways to collect information, and some of those are from the social sciences. And a social designer needs to be really familiar with those, even if the methodologies themselves aren't done in the same way that a social scientist might do. So design thinking, many of you may have heard of this. This is a framework that has come out of, originally from IDEO, which is a really awesome company that works globally. And the framework itself, it has empathy, define, which is also what we call research, ideation, testing, and prototyping. And it's not necessarily it's not a linear approach. There can be many different ways to enter into it and exit it and then circle around multiple times. The way we use it in social design is that we are specifically using it to address social problems. So design thinking on its own can be used to do anything, really. You could use it with a mattress company or a college, but we use it in terms of trying to help us underline the process as we go through it. And it is a really useful framework, although there are multiple ways to look at solving problems. So it's just one in our tool set. Visualization. Now, one of the things that people find really difficult out in the world is to take a huge amount of data and translate it into digestible bits of information. So the social designer, while isn't necessarily expected to be a graphic designer per se, still is anchored in the visual. We're trying often to take all this information and then find a way to make it compelling, to tell a story, and to help people understand it better. And this can be really enlightening for the people we work with, because they're so used to looking at things in spreadsheets that seeing it in a form like the image on the left, for example, can all of a sudden illuminate things that they had never thought about. So it's one of the things that we try to do, and it can be difficult if you're looking at a ton of information, but it's also really gratifying when you found a way to distill it to the essence. All right, so design entrepreneurship. This is really key, and one of the things that's actually emerging from this area is that social designers, in many ways, can work with other people to advance other things, and it doesn't have to end up being an actual sellable idea. But when a designer can turn their idea into a sustainable, lasting solution, that means that you're actually addressing the problem in the long term. And instead of just kind of swooping in and working with someone and then leaving and going to do something else, you're actually putting in time to to develop this idea. And in a lot of ways, we've seen a lot of success with that. So, yeah, Jonathan, before we move into your case study, do you have any input on design entrepreneurship?
It's critical in just kind of creating that sustainability, not just in terms of environmental, economic, but just kind of long-term. How do you see this change take place, and how do you make sure the change stays in a positive influence and doesn't necessarily get adopted or kind of adapted to something else or owned by somebody else?
Right. And one thing we should mention that's not covered in the principles is that social designers are heavily reliant on outside funding in order to get the ideas to, in order to basically do anything, you have to have funding if you want to be paid a daily wage. And so, you know, whether that's grants, fellowships, like Jonathan and I just completed the fellowship at MICA. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But social designers have to be really resourceful. And so design entrepreneurship is one way to do that without just relying on grant funding all the time. If you're creating a way to actually sustain yourself, that's a win-win. All right, so I'm going to hand the mic over to Jonathan. He's going to help you sort of walk through some of these principles with a real, like what he's been doing over the past 2 years.
Past 2 years. Hello, everybody. So a little bit of background before I jump into the case study. My background education was kind of in architecture and urban design. So I came from kind of this built environment lens. You might have seen from the social design core concepts that it seems maybe a little graphic design heavy, but this broader definition of design and kind of how does problem solving and creative problem solving into solutions is kind of what I brought to, I guess, the social design program and kind of what happened. And so through that, my work really started actually with the fallout from Hurricane Sandy. So natural disasters, the climate change, that whole discussion around kind of how are cities preparing for this environmental catastrophe and future catastrophes that are coming about. Specifically kind of in this site-based location of Baltimore. For those that are not familiar with Baltimore or not even from the United States, Baltimore is kind of this, it's a Rust Belt city in America, kind of post-industrial, aging infrastructure. We have one of the main attractions is kind of the Bay region. And so with that, of course, with natural disasters, the immediate thing that comes to mind is flooding and kind of the issues around water management. However, when you look at the greater extent of Baltimore, the harbor and kind of the bay, the water region is only one component of that. The general infrastructure of the city and kind of the built environment is all row homes, so it creates an interesting canvas to kind of think about natural disasters and how the city is preparing. My work specifically kind of focused in my backyard in this neighborhood called McKeldry Park in East Baltimore, which is not located at all on the harbor, but kind of landlocked by all these kind of developments, industrial parks, hospitals, and et cetera. It was kind of interesting to compare kind of these global efforts that are happening around climate change preparations and kind of natural disasters, and then focusing particularly on this one community which did not fit the norm as far as like on the coast and on the water, and had many other different issues to address, such as heat, stormwater runoff, and the host of health problems and everything else that kind of came from that. The neighborhood, as well, as you can see, it looks kind of like a hurricane actually went through. But it was, I would say, a premier kind of environmental justice community. So it kind of disinvested low-income, mixed minorities, incoming Hispanic and Latino populations. It was an interesting case study, and as the work progresses, you'll see of all these different issues kind of all colliding around one point, and then my focus particularly around kind of this environmental scene. So in addressing that and kind of going with the design process and what a social designer does is the first kind of step in approaching this issue and approaching climate change within this community was really kind of research on getting to know the place, which was somewhat easy to some extent because I lived in the neighborhood, but also taking that objective stance and stepping back and kind of realizing what is happening at face value, but thinking deeper about some of these social issues and other causes that kind of creates the condition which the neighborhood currently is. So getting to know the place, the people, and then also what is currently happening as far as different initiatives In this one community, there's 12 churches that play a huge role in kind of the development and just overall social discussion within the in the neighborhood, the political landscape between community associations and nonprofits working in the sphere, and also kind of the history of projects, some successful, some not, and kind of dealing with those issues and understanding those issues as I move forward with my project around climate change. So with that, the idea that kind of came to mind in synthesizing all this research and hopefully streamlining all these processes was realizing that there's a lot of these environmental organizations doing work in Baltimore, particularly in this community, and a lot of them have overlapping missions, overlapping statements, and they're all trying to accomplish this kind of environmental message that in itself lends itself to kind of climate adaptation and a longer discussion around climate change. But the problem that was happening was the residents themselves, going back to the people, were often getting approached just as many times, 38 times, whatever, as many times as the organizations wanted about weatherization, about green roofs, about permeable pavements, and kind of all these different strategies where they were being approached so many times that just in the sheer number, they were kind of being turned off and just like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. So the idea was to develop this kind of climate resilient block initiative within the community, and on a block-by-block basis, kind of walk through all of these things, working with all the partner organizations to try out all these climate adaptation and mitigation techniques, streamline that process, and then measure kind of the impact and where processes could be improved so that it was working on this very hyper-local context rather than kind of all these different organizations swooping in and working out. So in the research, then led to this concept, and then finally to act on it or to start prototyping it. So working with a bunch of residents who were very behind this idea and really wanted to kind of own this environmental pilot within the neighborhood. One of the first activities we did was just kind of a block cleanup around the block. So the litter and dumping is, of course, an issue very as often in some of these communities. So one of the things, I don't know if you can see the image here. So this is an abandoned lot. What you can't see here are some planters. So this used to actually be a community garden. But the person who was taking care of it and maintaining it kind of stepped away from the community when funding ran out. So it became overgrown. It attracted rats. The rats then or you could argue the rats attracted trash or the trash attracted the rats. But it became kind of this eyesore as well as kind of a detriment to the surrounding neighbors, as well as health issues and stuff like that. So the first activity of cleaning this area up and trying to change it was hugely supported by the residents as far as ownership in such a way that they actually ended up cooking us hot breakfast by the day that we're doing it. And for any of you that have done kind of community service or any type of volunteer work, hot breakfast for a volunteer day is major. It's huge. So it was kind of an amazing experience to see what all that was happening. So from kind of prototyping and acting, you also start learning lessons about how the project should possibly move forward and kind of the next iteration of what's going on, as well as kind of now completely immersed in the political landscape and kind of organizational landscape in the neighborhood. Myself, as someone who was really championing kind of this initiative and wanting to see it took place, as well as realizing my constraints that funding and my timeline in the neighborhood was limited by the fellowship, realized that the strategy and kind of this implementation goals would take much longer than what I originally expected, just kind of working through permits and working through city agencies as well as other departments. So realizing that and thinking more about kind of what else can be accomplished or what is another way this project can manifest within the community, and thinking even back about my own background in the built environment and architecture, my own biases kind of approaching this problem. So I started thinking other ways, and possibly the built environment was not the only solution. And then also kind of witnessing this experience with the community, or participating in this experience with the community, realizing that really the people are the quintessential factor to kind of all of this work. And that sounds kind of redundant, I mean, human-centered design and everything like that. But in thinking about that and applied to climate change during a natural disaster or during kind of this longer range plan around climate change, the greatest asset for communities, regardless of income and socioeconomic status, is the people themselves, not necessarily the built environment. So thinking about that and kind of shifting the focus, I switched from this environmental lens to this discussion around kind of social resilience. So how can you build the social cohesion and inclusiveness within the community, and in hopes that instead of necessarily an organization coming in and trying to champion a project, or myself included, the project would be championed and owned completely by the residents. So in thinking about that and trying to like, okay, how do we foster the social capital in the community, and building upon the other initiatives that are already happening, as well as trying to leverage all of that and make sure that the residents and community stakeholders are represented, that transitioned, and then also thinking graphic design and also what can I accomplish in a year, that's transitioned into this idea of the McKeldry Park Star, which is a newspaper that is written by residents for residents of the neighborhood. This by no means is anything innovative, but when you think of a newspaper not just as an information outlet, but as a way to build social cohesion, things start changing as far as the approach and kind of the tactics about what's going on. The community itself had never actually had kind of a newsletter for the community or a newspaper. So it was, and their thoughts when this idea was initially approached was it would be an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper folded in half, a community calendar on one side, and a letter from the president of the community association on the other. When you, kind of the background and knowledge that I had, as well as the design community and printing and all that other stuff, we were able to provide 24 pages of newsprint that we could pass out in mass, 3,000 copies to the community, to kind of leverage what was going on, as well as get the community voice and residents kind of introduced to what's happening, but also hopefully empower them to kind of move forward on that. So our process with that was working intensively with different residents, community organizations, and everything else, trying to make sure that there was an equal share of voice and kind of opinion on what was happening. Our editorial boards and kind of the entire process was very open source as far as anyone could contribute and anyone had a say. With that, there was a lot of residents that, of course, didn't have really any background in journalism and kind of writing and other things that we somehow layered in through classes and kind of just going through the process in various iterations. So what that allowed us to do was start opening the community and publishing it in a way that really opened it up to community groups as far as if they had picnics and neighborhood events. Allowed us to have residents, if they wanted to sponsor a basketball league or if they thought that the basketball court needed improvement, it allowed them to kind of have a voice and an op-ed in a way that the community itself never really had the opportunity to, or had often the preconceived notion of what the neighborhood was because of its disinvestment or low income status, was changed from this negative stereotype to something that was much more positive. As well as it illuminated the stories of some of the residents and some of the struggles, the day-to-day for some of these, as the day-to-day in the neighborhood. This gentleman here, Mr. Perry, recently just got out of 30 years of incarceration. His struggles in trying to find a job and homelessness really opened kind of, and he ended up writing a piece for a kind of an ongoing piece with the newspaper, kind of opened that discussion of empathy. It's like my neighbor, your neighbor, we're all in this together. How can we talk about it and how can we move together collectively? The other thing, kind of going to this visualization status and how that was going on, is we started not just accepting written material, but also kind of drawings and maps, which as a designer and kind of as any outsider going into a community, when we assess a situation or when we do our initial research, it's always entertaining because we always like map out, well, this is where the closest park is, or this is where the school or the church is. So obviously, because all of these areas are distributed and kind of far away, they obviously need a green space right here. When you open the conversation to drawing and kind of this other means of expression, you start getting really interesting conclusions about the neighborhood and kind of what is important and what is not important, which changes the perception that outsiders often kind of go into a situation with. So the visualization and kind of, as well, kind of a community that's not necessarily fully literate in some cases, it opened up that conversation in a way that allowed those people to participate, once again, kind of contributing to this goal of kind of social inclusiveness around social resilience. Another thing we tried to rethink and redo, and it's been through some iterations, is thinking about kind of the handoff. So typically when you have something like this, it's kind of secluded in a box on the side of a street in the United States, or in a community you might mail off the newsletters. One thing that we really got around and kind of got behind is actually having the residents pass out the newspapers to other residents so that they could begin conversations on the street. But once again, you kind of build that day-to-day face value with people, kind of saying, oh, we're all in this, we're doing this collectively. This is what's happening within the community. So here are some images, some shopping carts and stuff filled to the brim with newspapers as we do our Saturday pass out and kind of engage the entire community at once, door to door, knocking on people, and just having the kind of frank discussion on what's going on and what's happening. So through this process and kind of the lessons learned from me is, and I mean kind of also within the line of social design, is these changing definitions and kind of preconceived notions of what we imagine, in my case, a community to be, as well as other ways to kind of, how does this relate to climate change, and like the threads, I ended up in a place I would not imagine I would have started off as. So in the discussion of like, what is a community, when I first initiated, whenever anybody said like, what is a neighborhood or who represents a neighborhood, the immediate thought is a series of residents or the community leaders or maybe some organizations. But through the paper and kind of the process, we expanded that definition and kind of understood that there's a large part of community and people within a community that are not necessarily the first to mind. So we have, this is a list of kind of, and the list might give the wrong interpretation because the list gets shorter as you go from issue to issue. The side note, the other great thing about doing a newspaper is the iterative nature of it is it changes every issue, so we can understand kind of the adoption and the different techniques around this engagement. So with this, the expanded definition of community started including different schools, different teachers and stakeholders, actually expanding even to people who are currently incarcerated or kind of removed from the community. And kind of one of the things that we started doing was actually passing out newspapers to the local prisons and jails so that people that are currently behind bars, in some cases, can still understand what's happening. And then also, when they do transition out, it's something that they can kind of work with and kind of understand what's happening. Sustainability, that's the other big opportunity. Design entrepreneurship is one thing about it. But in thinking in terms of a paper, which most people and even myself argue that print media is dead, like what is the long-term goal for this, or what is the long-term impact and kind of catalyst for change? Right now, the paper is also sponsored by a grant. So we're looking, of course, at different advertising techniques and stuff, but also understanding this project that it doesn't necessarily need to last forever. If it could act as a catalyst for that initial contact or that initial conversation that then would lead to something else, then maybe it has accomplished its goal. So kind of through this continual iterative process of each issue, we're looking at different support and also just kind of reevaluating if the newspaper is actually needed within the community, which is a kind of a weird tangent to think about as a designer or as any kind of practitioner in the space, because you plan for the long term, you plan for like permanent change, but if this is just a spark that kind of initiates the other changes, that might have an overall greater impact. The other thing about kind of scalability that goes to question, and that many of you are familiar about, is maybe this newspaper is one neighborhood. We don't necessarily want this newspaper to change and kind of grow to a system of one organizational newspaper in Baltimore, because there's already a newspaper doing that. So what if instead of scaling in mass and kind of accumulating different principles and different jurisdictions, it becomes something where each neighborhood kind of can then open up and have their own community newspaper, own community kind of machine, community news machine that then can kind of cross-reference with each other and start creating, so from this organizational perspective to this ecosystem within Baltimore. So that's about it. Like, just kind of thinking about the sustainability and these different scalability, as well as just kind of how is it contextually appropriate within the community. So we strive to really kind of emphasize this idea of collaboration amongst residents and organizations and different stakeholders, funders, and everybody, but also empower the people that are currently not heard or kind of left out of the equation or often just glossed over because of preconceived notions from outsiders. So that kind of wraps up my case study.
Yeah, so thanks, Jonathan, for sharing your the work that you've been doing, which is, I just think is awesome. And so we will have some time for questions in a minute. We wanted to give you a list of resources, some places that you can go and find out a little bit more about human-centered design, how to do social change, social design on your own. You don't have to go get a master's degree in it, although I think both Jonathan and I would say it's been invaluable, and I don't think we'd be where we are today, but that being said, there's so many different ways to get engaged. So Human-Centered Design Toolkit is a great one. It's at IDEO.com. Collective Action Toolkit. Frog is mostly an industrial design firm that's global, and they've put together this toolkit, which is really a really great resource. Design for the Real World is a book by Victor Papanek, and that's an oldie but a goodie. It still relates after, I think, 30 or 40 years now. So prepare to be inspired by that book. Public Interest Design blog, also really great. And last but not least, Pinterest. So you can find so many great resources that way. I've done the same thing for visualizations if I want to look at how people visualize data, for example, on Pinterest. So, be creative with what you look for there.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Mira. So before we go to the question part, there was a question about whether or not there are templates or activities that you might be able to kind of orient people towards regarding work with community groups in order to reach a consensus for a clear way forward. And it's kind of the asker kind of points to how sometimes things are a bit difficult if individual agents come in with their own sort of agendas on what the outcome is and how they want to bring about positive change. So do you have any suggestions or resources, or maybe one of these resources would be particularly useful?
So,
well, I was going to say there is a helpful book. It's called Universal Methods of Design, and there's basically every page has a different way, a different exercise or a different tool for getting feedback or working with people. That's the first one that comes to mind.
And then for me, I would highly recommend the Collective Action Toolkit. Frog Design this is kind of their human-centered design and kind of approach into all of this, but they really stress kind of these principles and this way of thinking in a way that really opened it up beyond just designers. So I would definitely, if you're looking on kind of just community voice as well as kind of understanding how do you get this collective action and get kind of this initiative started, I would definitely recommend looking at them. And they line out their processes in very great detail as far as how they go about that, and different exercises and different techniques around facilitation to guide those meetings and some other things.
And to address your question about people coming in with an agenda into a new environment, well, the cynical way of looking at it is that everyone has an agenda. Now, whether or not that agenda has good or bad intentions is another story. I would say that the social designer does not go in with a huge ego and about knowing the answers, and that's where the collaborative aspect comes in, because if you come in knowing the answers, then you're not doing a project with people, you're just doing your own project. So if you come in and you say, I don't know the answers, but I want to find a way to address this problem because obviously it's been around forever, and whatever we're doing now, it's either not working or it's just not coalescing in a way that's going to make improvements. I mean, most people will say, yeah, there is a problem. Now, what that problem is, not everyone will agree on, and that's why you need to get people from all different places. And when the social designer is a facilitator, that objectivity gets put into place instead of saying, I'm here to do this on my own and put my stamp on it. One thing that is really, one thing that you'll notice with social design too is that while there is authorship, and when I say authorship, I mean saying like, oh, I did this or I made this. There is that in some senses. For the most part, you can't clearly say, oh, I made this by myself and this is mine. In social design, it's usually we made this or we did this or we're trying to do this. And you might have noticed with Jonathan's work that he wasn't making that newspaper by himself. It was everyone's newspaper, and so telling the story can be yours. How you tell the story can be unique, but you're not going in to say, here's my mark on the world and it's all mine and no one else can take credit for it. That is just not a social design thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, kind of building on the newspaper, that was a project I definitely worked on. It wasn't necessarily mine. It was something that was kind of collectively managed, and my role even really wasn't even the design and the layout. That was actually even kind of passed on to someone else. My main role with that was just actually the system behind it as far as content management and kind of how are we collecting all of these strategies and kind of different discussions and conversation points, not necessarily even like the editing was left to the residents. That was owned by someone else. But I was part of that machine to kind of get that initiated. So going back to Mira, like a social designer, this egoless discussion, like you are going into a situation with no preconceived notions about what is the answer, what is the appropriate thing. You might have ideas, but until you can fully understand the context of the situation you're working on, it's best to kind of keep those to yourself or only discuss those with people that are already working on these issues in a way so that you're collaborating, you're building on their initiatives, not necessarily starting your own.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in that sense, kind of an objective, egoless designer, social designer could also normalize or even out some of the individual agendas and biases among community members that might be in opposition to other.
Yes, yes, and that happens a lot. And that's really hard to navigate, but you have to do that. Yeah. And again, humility being such a key word. If you come from a place of humility and you say, you know, I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know all of the facts. I don't know this environment as much as you do. You know, help me understand or tell me your story. People will open up to you in a really great way. But if someone is guarded or cynical or doesn't want to work with you, there's probably reasons for that that go way back that have nothing to do with you, and you have to be okay with that, because just because, let's say, you could be a 23-year-old or a 35-year-old or a 50-year-old coming into a totally new environment and just be like, oh, I have all this great idea, all this great energy and these ideas. You're walking into a situation that has history with it. Sure. So you have to be mindful of that.
Building on that, nothing is a blank slate. Often in the case of design work, we're dressed with a blank computer screen or kind of a blank site canvas, but the cultural, political, and other kind of history and just organizational history within a space and within a place really kind of craft the narrative, as well as kind of what allows what you can accomplish and what you cannot accomplish into the future. So we're understanding that as you're moving into a community or as you are wanting to expand into a community is critical for success in those cases.
Right. And the social designer, too, has to be able to see gray where other people see black and white. Yeah. And what I mean by that is that, let's say you're going into an area that's been devastated by just joblessness, vacant housing, and there's a company coming in that's going to tear it all down and put a skyscraper up. The residents might be really irked by this situation. But if you come in and you're just like, yeah, okay, the developer's a bad guy and we're going to get him, like, okay, that's activism, but that's not social design. Like, you can take a point of view in activism. In social design, you have to remember, okay, where are the people? So, well, maybe I need to go talk to the developer and talk to the person in the human resources office and find out, like, why, for example, you guys are supposed to hire people in the neighborhood to do the work, the construction work. Why is that not happening? So you talk to HR person, maybe they say, oh, well, people above me push back on me when I show up with inexperienced people, or we've tried and no one wants to come work for us, et cetera, et cetera. So you try to put that human face on the issue, and then move back and say, okay, well, why is this happening then? Is there another way then to get to fill in that side of the equation? So you're not going and saying this is bad, this is good. I mean, there are clear-cut examples, but in social design, most of the time on the community end, you have a lot of people who maybe have good intentions, they're just going about it in a way that alienates other people. So you try to work that out.
The holistic approach is what we strive.
Yeah.
Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any other questions for our presenters, just use the questions box in your dashboard. So pressing ahead, in defining kind of the idea of social design, the idea of with and not for, and kind of this relates to what you have both been referring to, is really central to the idea that it's kind of a participatory process, not something imposed from outside. It just made me think when you guys were talking about this. I don't know if you've seen this episode of The Simpsons where Homer goes to visit his brother, long-lost brother, who owns a car company. And his brother gives him like free rein to design this car of his dreams. And it's this grotesque monstrosity. He's got this like soundproof bubble for the kids and everything. And it ends up sinking his brother's company. So there's a question in here. You know, as you guys are social designers with training and you have some experience and some expertise, but in the methodology of your actions, this is a process of co-creation and participation. How do you walk that line and find that balance between using your expertise as a guide and a way forward while still preserving that co-creation and not really just imprinting your stamp on whatever you want to achieve?
Right. Well, it's a balancing act because I can give you an example. I've been working with an organization in Baltimore that does food recovery. So they get really amazing food from the farmer's market that just hasn't sold that day and then distribute it at a farm stand in a neighborhood of Baltimore called Oliver. And when they approached me and MICA Social Design to help them with some communication-related needs and strategies, I was working with 2 undergraduate design students. At the time, we said, oh, well, what we need is signage, and we need a banner and truck design. And the client was interested and said, sure, let's that sounds good. Now, we don't know what needs to happen with it, so maybe just put a sign together. So we what we decided to do was we made some assumptions about, well, people at the farm stand need to know what to do with the food. Maybe they don't know what to do with it. And people at the farm stand need to know how to use the farm stand because it's confusing when you get there. So we went out, we did prototypes of the signs. So we just printed out on a piece of paper and put it into the sign hardware, took it out to the farm stand that day, and used our social science methodologies that we learned to figure out, okay, what do people do with the signs? So we observed, and then we also asked questions too. And one of the things we found was that no one noticed the signs. So here we have tried to come up with this really great solution to all of the problems of this organization with a sign, which I'm being a little bit facetious because obviously no one's going to solve all the problems of the sign. But it was one approach to see if it would be effective and helped with communication. And I had one of my interns go and ask a question. She'd never done this before. I gave her some ground rules, but the first thing she did was she walked up to an older gentleman and introduced herself and then said, so what do you think of the sign? And he looked at her kind of amazed and just like, it's fine. I don't know. I don't know what you want me to say. And the lesson from that was it's not about the sign, right? It's more about what information were the participants getting, what were they not getting, and was the sign fulfilling any of those needs? In this case, it wasn't. It was more grounded on the design side of what we think people want. So the next week we came back with a redesign of 2 of the particular signs, and it said how it works, and then it said this is where you get your number, this is where you line up, these are the times, and then another sign that just said you're in the right place, basically, like here's the logo, here's the information. And we just sat back and observed, and people actually looked at the sign. So instead of going up to a volunteer and saying, so how does it work, they were able to look at that, and then when they went to the volunteer, they said, okay, where do I get the number, or is there a place I can go and wait? Another thing that we did was we instead of asking the people there what they thought about the sign, we said, oh, so how do you know, where do you find information on like food when you don't know what it is, or what are your favorite things to eat? And so we'd get actual information from them about the things that they liked, and then we actually got people sharing information in the line too about the food that they were getting. Like, oh, you do that with beets? Well, my favorite recipe is blah, blah, blah. And so we learned a lot from that, and also we're thinking about, well, what are other ways we could get people talking to each other when they're there and getting to know each other, so expanding that sense of community. But it is, like I said, there is that balancing act of saying, coming in with an idea and trying it out, because most of the time the partners you work with, they don't want to come up with a new intervention that has, that's really slick and glossy. They just want you to help them figure something out. So you can say, we're going to try this thing, we're going to prototype it, very little cost, if any, and very little effort to put in. We're just going to try it and see what happens. Then you tweak it, people buy into it or not. You're getting actual feedback. So you're relying on like actual real world stuff instead of just what your own agenda is.
The only thing I would say to add to that, and kind of like personal understanding of your kind of perspective and your viewpoint on the world, so understanding your background and kind of understanding where your knowledge ends and where the community or the residents or the people that you're working with, they are truly the experts in the situation. And so how can you highlight and kind of emphasize the knowledge on both parts? It's tricky. It's not easy. And from project to project, it kind of different contexts, different ways of working, different means. But no, it's a challenge. It's not necessarily easy.
A different kind of question. Do you have any strategies for mobilizing people in your community or neighborhood for a situation that you want to change?
That's a good question, and one that I often think about in my own neighborhood and struggle with, because it's a lot easier to go into a different environment and do that, if for nothing else than that you're a new face and people are sort of intrigued. But if you have a particular issue, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is just to start doing informational interviews or just start talking to people. Don't go in saying, this is a problem, we want to fix it, but saying, so what do you think about X? Like, for example, there's an environmental issue in my neighborhood, has to do with stormwater runoff. So we're in an area where rain comes down, it just runs down hard surfaces and goes straight into the Chesapeake Bay. Before it does that, though, it causes a huge amount of flooding in our area. There's a lot of ways to mitigate that these days, whether it's through like larger scale interventions, like creating big storm drains, or smaller ones like rain gardens. But there's not a lot of information about like how to do this or where to get started. So instead of saying, well, we have this problem with runoff, and I'm going to make a rain garden, and I'm going to get everyone to sign on a petition. What another approach might be, well, let me find out how does this affect people in our neighborhood. So talk to my neighbor and say, hey, have you been having any flooding issues, or what happens to the water when it gets into your backyard? Saying like, what are some things that you are interested in? Is this an issue that's even priority? Because the other thing you have to be really mindful of is maybe this issue is important to you, but it's not top of mind for someone else. That's one of the things that we do often in like health and nutrition areas, is we put this baggage on other people to say, oh, well, obesity is a big problem in the United States. Well, poor people should eat better. They just need to eat healthier food, and here we just need to make them eat healthier food, which is really paternalistic if you think about it, patriarchal, I should say, to just say like, oh, well, if you're poor, you need to be eating this carrots every day, and it's your problem for being overweight. Instead, saying, well, why is it hard to get healthy food, and how do you get people to eat healthy food? And it's not just poor people. I mean, everyone basically could be eating better, but you have to move backwards from these sort of like assumptions of like what other people should do.
My recommendation, so if you're trying to start an initiative or kind of you want to start something within your own community, is start attending the meetings. Just show up, because what you'll find is you'll find partners who are either similar-minded or places where you can kind of have the platform to kind of leverage those meetings or leverage those kind of the audience that is already part of that conversation to push your initiative forward. And not just attend meetings on a community level, but also thinking more in terms of like city or state. In Baltimore particularly, after attending a few different greening meetings on those areas, I found out that the city is interested in doing some different pilot projects in the community or some other initiatives that you can possibly build on rather than kind of just championing for yourself. It's how do you kind of contribute to the overall energy. And so And I mean, though, more than likely, I mean, in the case in Baltimore and pretty much across the United States, if you start showing up and it's more energy to add to that meeting or someone else who can help out, that's going to lead you so much further than kind of being the renegade trying to, this is going to solve all of our problems, or this is going to solve, I have the idea that's going to spark everything. Really kind of understanding that context, what's happening, what's going on. So yeah, show up to meetings. That's redundant, but yeah, it's what it is.
Yeah, and do informational interviews and talk to people and find out, well, what are they working on? I mean, I'm saying like in the nonprofit sphere, in the municipal government, corporations, like it never hurts to talk to more people.
Yeah.
So in thinking about this and in the 7 core principles you guys laid out in the presentation, it seems like, a lot of people think about design thinking and they kind of lose sight of this larger context and a process in which, that one step is embedded. I also kind of loved how the way you laid it out, the last part of that process ends in action. And in Mira's blog, in kind of reading through some of this before today, she mentioned something about how oftentimes people in the business world tend to distill design thinking into a formula rather than seeing it as this kind of messy looping process. So it seems like what you guys are saying is, although action is part of this process, the process itself is more important. But if that's true, where does the action, which is the ultimate end result you're looking for, where does that fall in this kind of scale of priorities?
Wow, I mean, the action part is the one I have the hardest time with because I'm a perfectionist and I always worry that it's not going to work out. That's where prototyping saves the day, because if you're going to try something and you set the stakes, I don't want to say low, but let's say it's low risk in that you're not sinking a huge amount of resources into this one idea or this one method, then you can try something and learn from it and go back and revise it. So you haven't wasted a lot of time or energy. And one of the things that makes designers really unique is the ability to visualize something and make it happen really quickly and not be super concerned about getting everything right at the first time and not doing it perfect.
It's kind of building off of that. So the moment of action is reoccurring. It's happening kind of within each of these larger core principles, within all these different types of processes. But it's not going to be this grand action that saves the day. We're really stressing kind of these small opportunities where we can test out kind of a rough prototype, a sign, or maybe a newspaper or something like that. But it builds with that. The action kind of starts changing those small little levers that both inform the process and kind of inform the different understandings, but also kind of are overarching, kind of lead to this larger change or this larger goal.
Right.
So it's present throughout. It is a step at some point, but it is something that is, even within research, the interviews, that's part of action. Like, how do you frame the interview? What does that look like? What are the questions you're asking? What is the approach on understanding that? Conceptualizing, like, what is that process of how you are synthesizing all this information or kind of understanding all these different things? And how does the results of that kind of manifest? And once again, how is it rooted in the context? So it kind of happens through every point. Just it happens on a smaller scale than I think most people would generally understand. As far as, it's not going to be, oh, here's this house, or here's this complete master plan for a neighborhood. I mean, it will eventually lead to that, but it's, what are the small steps to get there?
Yeah, and if we could teach everyone, or at least a good portion of people in government, how to do these techniques, I mean, that's where you would get huge change on a policy scale, which would be great. And I think that there's one Scandinavian country that does actually have, is it Denmark or Finland? It's either Denmark or Finland. They have a social designer in the government who basically has a lot of responsibility for policies and looks at the way things work together, and just an amazing way of looking at how you could change at scale. But for now, we social designers are kind of on the grassroots side, and that's really great. But as the field grows over time, we expect to see more of this integrated into day-to-day life. And I would say, too, these skills are not just for social designers. We would hope that everyone integrates them into their day-to-day lives to make positive change in what they do. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this is the first part of a two-part series, which is more focused on kind of giving a broad overview of what social design is and what the process looks like. Please remember to join us next week as we go through more specific tools and how you would actually implement aspects of social design, specifically with problem definition or problem defining and network diagramming. So that will be next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions that we didn't get to or follow-up things that you might think of later on for Mira or Jonathan, please contact them there. You can find their email addresses on the screen. There's also some websites there.
Feel free to reach out if you have problems that you want maybe some advice on or kind of mentorship on. As well, if you're across the globe, we kind of know different aspects in different places that are trying this out. So if you're interested in social design, we can hopefully also point you in a place that's local to where you're located. So feel free to reach out, email us with questions, comments, regards to those.
Yeah, and if you want to find out more about the MICA Social Design Program, you can follow this web URL. And then if you have any questions about YouthActionNet, we have our contact information there for you. As you start signing off and we start closing down the webinar, we have a very short 2-question survey, so you can provide us with some feedback just to make sure that we're providing the most interesting and relevant webinars for you guys as you grow through your leadership and entrepreneurship journeys. So be sure to join us next week as we delve deeper into social design, including another guest, YouthActionNet fellow Jessica Lax and her new initiative, School for Change. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.